I'd now like to welcome Professor Peter Yu AM to the stage for his keynote presentation. Professor Peter Yu AM is a Yawuru man from Broome in the Kimberley region in northwestern Australia with over 40 years experience in Indigenous development and advocacy in the Kimberley and at this state and national and international levels. As an advocate for the social and cultural economic advancement and well-being of Kimberley and other Aboriginal communities for his entire career, Professor Yu has been instrumental in the development of many community-based organisations and initiatives which have had an enduring influence on the Kimberley region. He was an executive director of the Kimberley Land Council, a member of the national leadership team negotiating the federal government's response to the 1992 I said that through too many nines there, didn't I? Mabo High Court judgment. Professor Yu was a key negotiator on behalf of the Yawuru native title holders with the West Australian Government and recently was Chief Executive Officer of the Yawuru Corporate Group. He was the chair of the Indigenous Reference Group, IRG, to the Northern Ministerial Forum on Northern Development. Professor Yu is the current inaugural Vice President First Nations portfolio at the Australian National University. He is also the Deputy Chair of the Northern Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance, Board Member of the Water Trust Australia, Trustee of the Prince's Trust Australia, Council Member need to be corrected here, Jana Sustainability Advisory, and Chair of the Australian Advisory Group to Rio Tinto. So he's a very busy man. Thank you for your
Make me feel a little bit ashamed. Saying all those things make me feel old. I am, of course.
Did you want to put that on your... Is that easier to put it on your...
This one?
Your...
Yeah, probably. I'm not one for technology, no matter how simple it is. Thank you very much for that warm welcome. I'm not using the term AM at the moment. I've been thinking about giving it back, given what happened a couple of Saturdays ago. I just don't feel very comfortable with it right now. It doesn't sit comfortably with me. But thank you, Shireen, for the welcome to the Goldfields, and I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to all of the people here. Can I also acknowledge all of the Wangkawa people from throughout the Goldfields region who continue to deal with the impacts of mining on your country, often without your agreement. I acknowledge all the other First Nations people attending this conference, or at home, even if they're not here, in their communities, who are tirelessly working to preserve and revitalise the language. And I'm also very pleased to see many familiar faces and friends that are here today. I acknowledge Minister Booty, and who I know has had a long-standing interest in the rights and historical experience of Aboriginal people. And also his colleagues, the Minister for Kalgoorlie, Ellie Kent, and the member for the MLC, Kyle McGinn. Thank you for your words. But I do want to particularly acknowledge Sue and her team and commend your language centre, the Goldfields Aboriginal Language Centre, for convening this conference. But also for your ongoing passion, because I think I said yesterday we met up in Fitzroy Crossing, I'm not sure when, probably back in the early 90s or something, when you were working at Kalgoorlie Adult Education Centre and I was working for the KLC. I'd like to give a special shout out and thank you to the Jumpan Choir. Clearly an important and exact and necessary investment in the future of languages. But before I go into my presentation, can I just acknowledge the recent passing of a very senior Kimberley man. Those of people from the Kimberley will know, and some of you may have heard of Komandjai Brown, who is a very senior traditional Walmatjari man who recently passed away a couple of days ago. And we've paused to acknowledge people, and I'd like to include him in that acknowledgement. He was a very close friend and a mentor, and I'm very happy to see that Wazzy is here as his appointed deputy to the Kimberley Law and Culture Centre. So the succession has already started in terms of the critical importance of the imperatives of transfer of knowledge and leadership. But he's a man who has dedicated his entire life to the law, the country, the language and his people, not just to his own people, but to others as well. I might just tell you a very quick story. I digress for a slight little bit, but I think it's important because he was involved in this and just indicates his leadership. But in 1996, we were celebrating the Kimberley Land Council's 20th anniversary. We were at Jalbananga community, which is just outside of Derby, near Luma. Those of you familiar with the Kimberleys, and I was CEO of the Kimberley Land Council. We were celebrating our 20th years, and I could see a group of senior men sitting around talking as senior men do, and this was kind of in the late dusk period before we were all going to break to go and have dinner. And then, in fact, it was afterwards, I think, and it was in the midst, of course, of the forthcoming Republic debate in 1999. And I could see Kumanjai Brown sitting and talking with a group of people, and then as we were about to sit down, the sun was going down, an old man got up and said, "Young fella, you got to go see the old girl overseas." And I thought, I said, "Could you explain that again?" And he said, "You got to go see the old girl overseas." And I got it, he meant the Queen. And I said, why do we have to go and see the Queen? Because we were discussing the Republic and the position of the monarchy, of course, and the question of the future status. He said, because they call him by his name the wrong way. And so what he was talking about, of course, was the fact that the only time we know the Crown is when our people are being harassed or locked up by the police and put in prison. So we were talking about this whole question of where does reconciliation sit and within the notion of the Republic. So this was a debate the community was having. So he was basically saying, you have to go and see the Queen to tell her that this country is calling her name in the wrong way. Because whatever you might think about the nature of the history of colonisation, invasion or settlement, whatever your view is, there was kind of a familiarity, I think anyway, that I've seen that people have with the monarchy in terms of the ritual and the culture and all that sort of stuff that communities have, if you take it out of the political domain. And he was saying if you should go there and pay respects, because if Australia is talking about reconciliation, how are we to reconcile with England? How is the Queen supposed to reconcile? So this is the level of sophistication of the discussion that was happening in the community level. So I said, yeah, that's a very good idea. So we did organise a visit to see the Queen. So Johnny Watson, who was then by chair of the Kimberley Land Council, and Kumanjai Brown, who was the chair of the Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Culture Centre. We organised, we had to raise money in a very short space of time, 6 months, and we made a trip. We presented at Buckingham Palace some gifts. It was a very well-known Aboriginal artist from Wangka, Mrs. Brown, not related to Kumanjai, but we did that, and then 12 months later we actually went and saw the Queen. I wrote, actually, it's funny, I was actually at Kalgoorlie Centre. I wrote a letter to the then Governor General. It was Governor General Dean at that time, and I wrote to him and said, "This is the instructions from our community. We want to go and meet the Queen." And anyway, I was actually in Kalgoorlie. That day, I got a phone call in the days of the old brick mobile phones, and it was. The voice on the other line said, "Oh, it's Bill Dean here." It was the Governor General ringing me at Fitzroy Crossing, and said, "I got your letter. Why do you want to see the Queen?" And I explained to him the background, and he said, "All right, here's a telephone number, ring, somebody's waiting to talk to you. So he gave me a number, and I rang this number, and I was talking to the Queen's Private Secretary in London. And they said, I've been expecting your call. So we actually organised that there was a senior delegation that went in '99, which Pat Dodson, Marcy Langton, Lower Joe Donoghue, Gutchell Jakura and myself went to have an audience with the Queen following the request that old Kumanjai Brown and his senior people had asked us to do. So the reason I raise that is because of what I'm about to embark upon here in terms of my presentation to you today. Because we are meeting at a critical time and juncture in our nation's history. And I don't need to tell you that, but the devastating rejection by the Australian people of our request for recognition in the Constitution has caused grief and anger amongst many of us. I think most of us believe, knowing cynically, that defeat was likely. It was a vicious and toxic campaign dominated by lies and conspiracy theories that had nothing to do with the simple question that was put to the Australian people. The ask of Australian people was clear and harmless question to recognise us as in the nation's founding document and give us a voice to advise Parliament, the government, about laws and policies that affect us. Such a modest request, one would have thought, as we did less than a year ago, that the overwhelming majority of Australians would have embraced this small but symbolic, powerful amendment. If you really understood it, it's the most simplest of simple proposition. An advisory body with no power of authority to advise government on matters that are relevant and pertinent to us. The reason I emphasise that is its simplicity is in the nature of the degree of rejection and what that means for us. After all that had been done to us, our land stolen through violent conquest, and our parents, grandparents and great-grandparents enduring and surviving the relentless tide of cultural genocide by government policies and practices, leaving, as is stated in the Uluru Statement, the torment of powerlessness, the legacy experienced by so many of our people. We would have thought that there was goodness in the hearts of most Australians to simply write yes and reach out to forge a new relationship in a spirit of healing and reconciliation. The fact that the rejection was so overwhelming in every Australian jurisdiction except the ACT, which doesn't count within the nature of the majority of states, which made me quite feel unsettled, given that I've moved to Canberra in the last couple of years, having come from the Kimberley. So of course my vote is counted in ACT. My vote was not being counted in terms of what this was happening. But it left me with a gut-wrenching emotion which I find very difficult to express in words. And I know there are many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who feel the same way. As a people who have never ceded our sovereignty, most of us have a complex and ambiguous relationship with the Australian nation. But I had thought that there was hope to build a new, just and inclusive Australia. Before the 14th of October, I had thought that the torturous part of reconciliation was worth walking along. But I think there are many questions being asked today now about reconciliation. Many of our commentators and senior people are saying reconciliation is dead. You have to seriously question where reconciliation is at. I think we're in a very serious predicament, and we need to challenge and question ourselves about exactly where we are as a country, and in particularly in terms of reconciliation. So over the last 10 days, I've been doing a lot of reflection about the position of First Nations people within Australia. The referendum result, in a sense, has drawn a line in the sand concerning our relationship with settler Australians in society and governments. And unfortunately, I have to leave early, but I'm hosting a meeting of the senior leadership in Canberra on Thursday in respect to this question of what our response should be. I was hoping to stay here. I was looking forward to staying here. It's a long time since I've been at a conference like this. I was quite keen, and thank you, Sue, again for the invitation to come here to be part of this So that the referendum results clearly demonstrate that while governments have responsibility to support us, we cannot depend on them to deliver the things that are fundamentally important to us. You may ask, what has this to do with language and the conference? But language, like land, always was and always will be about politics and power. It's not just about speaking your language, it's not just about learning and understanding your language, but it's what defines us, and the whole thematic approach to this conference is about that point. It's about the power of language, and it's about the politics of language. It defines us as a distinct people, our languages do, our culture, and our connection to our country, but also our responsibility, not to governments, but to our people and to our country. And we must determine, in this period of history, how our languages are protected and revitalised. We must own the risk ourselves of sustaining what is an integral part to our existence in maintaining the integrity of what defines us. I was involved in the negotiations in regards to the post-Mabo decision, Native Title Act. I've been involved in initiating many of the land claims, native title claims in the Kimberleys, even my own. And, you know, I think about that a lot. And as important as people might think the ethnography in relation to anthropology and defining kinship and sister relationship, the one thing that was always missing for me was language. What we should have been doing is giving evidence in our language. First and foremost, we should be talking in our own language. That is so critical. And along with perhaps, you know, an ethnobotanist, so that botanist, I think you're Harry from Laura later on is an expert in IP area, but the nature of our visceral and real nature of our relationship with our land, and what makes up our relationship with that land. And I think what we've seen is that it's taken a long, drawn-out, very expensive, highly political, very divisive discussions and in native title. I think language is something that was missing. It was very central to the nature of our arguments about us, our claims to our country. So that there is a means, this means that refocusing our efforts on ourselves in a sense of unity and local and regional integration. The problem is, we all know with colonisation that the relationship with government has segmented us. Our community owned organised tend to work separately and in silos because of the way government's funding and program and administration work. We should not mirror the siloed dysfunction of government. The truth is that the Aboriginal world is integrated through language to culture, country, and our family and social connections are all interconnected. That is our strength. Our community-based operations should reflect who we are. Language centres, land councils, native title body corporates, art centres, resource agencies have been developed to represent the rights and interests of First Nations peoples. They do not serve government, they serve our communities. And we have to remember that. Because it's very easy to forget, because you're always looking to where the next dollar is coming for your organisation. And really we should come together at the local, regional and statewide level to determine how best to defend and promote our rights to speak and revitalise language and to practice our laws and culture and exercise our rights over that country. If we don't do this, government will continue to ignore us. Our political strength is in our unified position. That's when governments take notice. I'll talk about this a bit more, but I want to say to point to the theme that you have chosen for this conference, Decolonising First Nation languages, could not be more appropriate or inspiring given the challenge we have. It is a central piece to where we are situated today in the history of our relationship as First Peoples with the settler nation. It's kind of ironic, a sad irony, that I'm really not here speaking my language. Yarra language. I certainly, like a lot of people I know, little bits and pieces and stuff. We all spoke a version of Creole in Broome, which I spoke. You probably wouldn't understand what I was saying half the time anyway, but which is a little bit different to the way when it moves further inland into Fitzroy, Derby, Fitzroy up that way, mainly because of the kind of Asian influence. Broome, as you know, is quite different in the Australian landscape. We're probably more part of Asia than we were Australia at that time, when they needed people like my father, a Chinese, as a pearl diver, needed him and others because of the indentured labour needed for the pearling industry, of course. Broome was the pearling capital of the world prior to the discovery of oil after the Second World War. It was a prized commodity, but of course with the invention of plastics, it's more dealt these days in relation to everybody thought it was about jewellery, the pearl, but in fact it's a shell. And the best shells in the world grow off Broome for some reason or another, the right climate and conditions that operate there. And we have been trading pearl shells. Yaru people and Garjari people have been trading pearl shells, and Badi people as well too. Jawi people have been trading shells for 20,000 years. If you go to Alice Springs in the old days, you'll see through the kind of where the trading routes and also the cycles, ceremonial cycles run all the way down hundreds of, if not thousands of kilometres been traded. So it's a prized commodity. I actually went to a museum in Paris. There's a museum on the mother of pearl, and a man that I met there, I couldn't speak French, he couldn't speak English, but someone interpreted for us. He said that, I asked him why the pearl shells from Broome, and he said because of it is the best shell in the world. Mother of pearl come from the northwest coast. So I guess, and the reason is, of course, my background is I'm third generation Catholic mission. My grandmother was a Bunaba woman taken from her family around about 1910 from Fitzroy Crossing area to Beagle Bay Mission, raised there. I was told a story about one of my old aunties that my great-grandmother actually followed behind the cart that was taking my grandmother to Fitzroy Crossing. And hence when my mother was born, she was put in a dormitory, and when I was about 11 years old, I got sent away to Catholic mission school in Perth. People talk about it nicely. I don't, because I think people don't understand the sense of the brutality of the intervention. We look back at it now and we think, oh, you know, it was for your own good, you went to school in Perth, learn. But I was sent to a Catholic mission, and we went to a day school to Clontarf. And I don't see it as that. I don't see it as my parents, my grandparents having any say necessarily in this. So I have a fairly different view from a lot of people about this. But these were systematically the nature of the system, the processes that actually kept us away. I remember my grandfather speaking, you know, Yaru up there on the hill, a place called Kennedy Hill in Broome, what his white name is, and being there when he was talking with and mixing with all the other people from around Garjari, Nyigada, Mangala, Badi, Jawi people there, all there for the pearling industry, all talking, and I remember them doing ceremonies and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, the severing of the transmission of language, and there are many people like me, I'm not the only one, there are many people like me, where the severing of the transmission of language from our grandparents' generation to our parents was brutally and humanely effective. And that's why I'm so personally passionate about language, even if I don't speak my language properly. I understand the power of language, and I understand it more so in terms of what it means for us today. So the West Australian government, like all other Australian governments, knew that language and culture was indivisible. You have to think about this strategically. Language is not just language. Language and culture are core components of the part of identity. It informs us and shapes us into the people we are. So there was a deliberate strategy to colonise the people, to disenfranchise, to segregate. It was about killing their language. because that was the stated aim of governments, was to finish us off as a distinct people. And this remained as part of formal policy until the 1970s, where various descriptions such as biological absorption and assimilation, the targeting of our language, was fundamental to their cultural genocide objectives. Let's not hesitate to think that the intention was deliberate, not deliberate, that this was all accidental or coincidental. You have to think that this was a deliberate strategy. You have to think that the apartheid laws that operated in this state, and Canada and Queensland and every other state, was transported to South Africa in 1948 to become the apartheid regime. My mother and father were not allowed to marry because it was against the law to cohabit with a native. Broome had a colour-coded system of surveillance by the native protector and the police on where the relationships were having between white people and Aboriginal people, Asian people and Aboriginal people, and where whites alone and where blacks alone and where Asians alone. There was a colour-coded system that existed so that the police could keep surveillance. My mother was working for a dentist as a maid, and she, like all of her generations, and I know there are people sitting in this room who remember this, had to apply to become an honorary citizen. Now, to become an honorary citizen, you are not allowed to speak your language. You have to remember that. You weren't allowed to associate with your kin. You had to be outside of town after 6 o'clock at night because there was a curfew. I still live on an Aboriginal reserve in Broome that was created way back then, partly for people to be outside of the town precincts. If you were caught in town, you were arrested. So you can't delineate or distinguish the nature of where language sits in the historical history of where we find ourselves today. To do so would be to deny the nature of the integrity and the relevance of the importance of language itself. But I know that my grandmother, even though I was told stories when I was little, I didn't know my grandmother. She died in a cyclone in 1957. Only one of two people who died in Broome in 1957. I tried to find the police records to find out exactly what happened, and all I found was something like 2 natives killed. I went through the library and tried and checked up to see. I wanted to know a bit about the history of what happened. But all it was some notification from the police about 2 natives had been killed, and that was it. My uncle was part of it. House fell on them, and I know my uncle was traumatised for most of his life, even though people saw him as a very jovial and friendly, and really he was a very decent man. But I personally believe he was significantly traumatised by the nature of being caught up when my grandmother and my auntie, my mother's sister, were killed in that. So, we've been talking about, when I talk about the brutality of colonisation, it wasn't nice. So what we're talking about is the speaking of language of mothers and grandparents. Generations, thousands of years, were being forbidden to be spoken. And then when your children get caught, they are punished. They suffered cruel punishment for speaking their language. That's exactly what happened, and I'm sure this is a familiar story from no matter where you come from. I want to put a bit of a serious edge on it because I do think that we tend to think today of language as a quaint kind of historical kind of necessity and need that we need to have to, acknowledge the poor natives. But it is a political force. It is a critical political force. And this happened, whether it be the churches or the missions or the government institutions right across Australia. Dormitories are used to separate children from their parents to compound this attack on language. I've said a bit about my history in relation to that. I'm just trying to give context to the nature of my experiences of language. So our language was, is the first casualty in this cultural wars. Our resistance to this was basically speaking our own kind of room Creole, if you like, which has changed quite considerably. Some people still speak it, but as you know, growing up as a child, it was our lingua franca. But that also was viciously attacked by Catholic priests and brothers and nuns who control our lives when we were speaking, because that's all we knew. We grew up speaking that was our lingua franca, our type of Creole. But, you know, while the institutional architecture of assimilation and its underpinning philosophy of white supremacy shaped my life, I did not become the product of the assimilation policymakers intended. My serious job after leaving school was I worked for the WA Museum as an Aboriginal site recorder, which took me back to the Kimberleys, to the heartland of the culture that government had tried to extinguish. I soon found myself exploring the northwest Kimberley interior and coast with senior Badi Jawi, Wanambal, Wawara and Ngarinyan men, which was a most profound effect that in a deep and meaningful way was to shape the rest of my life. These men of high culture, and some of them, their family are here today with me from that area, you know, so clearly demonstrated how language also holds the stories and knowledge of country, the systems, the tides, the currents, the animals, the weather patterns. I spent 4 weeks in a 40-foot aluminium dinghy from One Arm Point all the way up to Hall Point recording sites before the Yapi Peninsula became a military training base, basically living off the ocean with three of the most senior cultural figures alive at that stage. Just basically having a early morning call at 6 o'clock with the flying doctor services, just checking to see we were still alive. But working like that experience, it took me throughout the Kimberley, working with a number of roles, extraordinary men and women who spoke as their first language. Wanambal, Gidja, Mirong, Gajarang, Jaru, Walamajari, Ngarinyan, Bunaba Guniandi, Wankujunga, Nyigana, Mangala Karajari Jaru, Nyul Badi, Jawi, and many more. I was in my mid-20s at this time when these great leaders came together politically to assert their inherent rights as traditional owners who had never ceded their sovereignty to the colonisers. In 1978, we formed the Kimberley Land Council to fight for our land rights, and not long after that I was employed as the KLC's first field officer. My job was travelling throughout the Kimberleys with 3 senior cultural leaders, setting up the communication channels with every community in the Kimberleys. Happening at the same time was the negotiations for the Argyle diamond mine, which would later become the largest diamond mine in the Southern Hemisphere, where the traditional owners, Gidja people and some on the Mirong side, basically were not involved in any discussions or negotiations in what was happening. So they were happening at the same time. The emergence of this campaign reached a political flashpoint over the Nukunba mining dispute in 1980. Some of you will remember that, which had national implications that later propelled the national battle on Aboriginal land rights. And again, we were one of the first organisations into the United Nations process, which eventually led to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, then it was the Subcommission on Human Rights, and then the Full Commission on Human Rights. In 1981, the Fraser government created the National Aboriginal Conference, and then many of the old people I had worked for encouraged me to stand for the elections of the West Kimberley electorate. I had no idea about politics, I had no idea about what NAC was, but I was thrown in the deep end because the senior people said, we want you to be there. And I suspect the only reason was because I probably spoke a little bit better English than they did. And they thought I had an education, but I didn't have an education. I left school at year 11. I'd never been to university. I'd never done any of those studies. But I can tell you that I have learnt most of everything I know from the senior people. After I was elected, I committed to help build an organisational infrastructure to support the old people's quest for decolonisation and for their communities to live with dignity and respect according to their customs and their languages, so they desperately sought to pass on their children. In 1984, I was able to collar enough resources to convene the largest bush meeting that ever been held in the Kimberley and Ngumban community near Fitzroy Crossing. That meeting endorsed the creation of 2 regional community-based organisations, the Kimberley Language Resource Centre and the Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Culture Centre. I think I was the inaugural chair for the Kimberley Language Resource Centre for about a few months till we got the governance structure set up and then handed on to somebody more appropriate. As well, the meeting also endorsed a proposal to establish Australia's first ever Indigenous community-owned publishing house, Wangkawa Books. So we were in an era where we thought, people aren't listening to us. We were starting our political movement. We need to have our own voices heard the way we want that to be heard. Our intention was to have an integrated regional organisational structure that reflected our societal reality, connecting the land, the culture and language with the capacity to tell our stories. I look back with immense pride at that Bush meeting almost 40 years ago. The organisation that were born out from that meeting was KALAC, the KLRC and Wangkawa, and are still growing strong today. And with the KLC, they remain the bedrock of regional politics for Kimberley Aboriginal people. The Kimberley Language Resource Centre is a regional language organisation for the Kimberley region of Western Australia. And I'm so pleased that representatives of KALAC and other Kimberley language organisations are here participating in the conference. Established in 1985, I know I'm going on for a while, but I'll try and be as quickly as I can. KALAC, of course, supports Aboriginal people to continue using their languages. It is and was, that is, the Kimberley, the most linguistically diverse area in Australia with at least 42 language groups prior to colonisation. KLRC's contribution maintains and revitalisation of Kimberley has been enormous. It provides skill workshops and project advice for language groups across the region. It has community support for many language groups and engages with a significant number of stakeholders locally, regionally and nationally. So, yet, for all its success, I've seen how difficult it has been for the KLRC to sustain itself with such insecure funding. I've seen the dedications of many people over the years to KLRC about being totally committed to strengthening and maintaining language. We should acknowledge the resilience, and I've said that at the beginning, all the people working in this field, language speakers, directors on the boards of language organisations, language workers, administrators and linguists. Despite all the hard work being carried out in this fundamental mission of protecting and revitalising language, we have to face the reality of the fragility of the status of First Nations languages in Australia today. Of the 250 First Nation languages that have survived the onslaught of colonisation, the Australian Bureau of Statistics data shows that less than 16% of First Nation households speak traditional language at home. The truth is the capacity of First Nations people to pass on our language to our children and our children's children is continually being challenged and eroded. The survival of First Nation languages is not just a critical matter of national significance, it is a global issue. We are now in the second year of the International Decade of Indigenous Language that was proclaimed by the UN General Assembly to draw global attention to the critical situation to Indigenous language. Yes, yet what is Australia's response to this global issue of significance? The truth is very little. Where is the national commitment to turn around the impact of the past genocidal policies that have designed to extinguish our language and cultural identity? The Australian Government's commitment to First Nations language is a paltry $27 million, made available under a federal government Indigenous language and arts program that is hidden away in a unit in the Department of Infrastructure and Transport, Regional Development and Communication and the Art. That program is in part funds a network of 24 Indigenous language centres throughout Australia. I will speak more about national policy and public investment concerning Indigenous language, but I want to make a fundamental point that I think is missing in the whole discussion about preserving our languages for now and future generations, which is consistent with this theme here today. And that is, the support for First Nation language is a vital political issue. It should not be marginalised as an esoteric area of mainstream cultural and artistic interest as it is expressed in the Albanese Government National Cultural Policy Statement that was released early this year. Government policy and public investment supporting our language should reflect the First Nations perspective that links language, culture, land and identity. Therefore, support for language should be connected to policies concerning native title, land rights and agreement making. It can't sit aside to that. It is centre and core to all of those policies. So I talked a little bit about what's happening in the Broome situation. We ran a federal court case for about 14 years. So in 1994, we had a successful outcome. At that stage, we only had about 3 to 4 full-time Yawuru language speakers. Pat Dodson and I were the two key negotiators in relation to that. I was the inaugural CEO. First thing I did was set up our language, an ability to look at our language centre, knowing full well the importance of that. It was critically important in terms of our determination of native title. We were very lucky at that stage to have my relations, Mrs. Edgar, who's passed away, her daughter Di, young Dahlia Pigram, and I would say also Lola Jones, Noongar woman from Perth, provided great support for us. So we had great support from Noongar people in terms of their helping us to revitalise. We developed a Canadian methodology. Basically, was able to attract some private money, philanthropic money, where we had to teach teachers. My sister, who couldn't speak the language, is now a fluent speaker and teacher of Yawuru in Broome. We now teach to about 1,500 kids. You know that song, what's it called? It's on ABC. Used to be an ad about We Are Australians. It was one of the first things we did was we converted that into Yawuru, and that took off. We had people from all over the country ring us up and saying, even RSL clubs saying, can we use this, can we use that? It was quite an interesting phenomenon, really. So what I've talked about really is the kind of the challenges we've had to endure. And the critical part of where it plays in the nature where we are today. The proposition, of course, is that you can't distinguish it from the other nature of our political ambitions and an assertion of our interests and our rights. We were lulled into a false sense of security in 1967 with the Constitution. All it did was struck down that excluded us from the Commonwealth responsibility, which allowed us to be counted in the census. We all thought that 1967 was really a line in the sand. Everybody said, well, it's a citizenship right, but it wasn't. It only allowed us to be counted in the national census. So the results of the referendum means that we have to recalibrate our thinking and strategic approaches about our position here in Australia. Because I don't believe we can underestimate the threat that we are facing as Aboriginal people. The campaign, as we know, was ruthless and vicious, and it unleashed a torrent of racist attacks. Its whole campaign was aimed at the underbelly of settled Australian racism. They have an ideological agenda to reinstate assimilation as the underlying philosophy of government policy. This is the critical thing you have to understand about the nature of the takeaways from the referendum and the implication it has for language. It is philosophically underpinned by the nature to assimilate us. That is the serious challenge, I tell you, in my view, that we are facing in this country. They want us to return to the 1901 Constitution that sanctioned our disappearance as First Nations of Australia. Don't let the smart words fool you about these things. And I'm not an ideological warrior, and this is not a conspiratorial proposition. All you need to look and understand is about where history has taken us and where we're now starting to move back towards. So this victory has emboldened the assimilationist agenda. They are not just a fringe group of mad right ideologues. They have the alternative Prime Minister and the alternative Minister for Indigenous Australians in their camp. And we know from history that when assimilation is the philosophical framework that guides Aboriginal policy and funding, First Nations languages are the first casualty. And I certainly don't want to sound alarmist or defeatist in this presentation. That is not my intention. Quite the opposite. I want to say that settled Australians' rejection of our genuine and modest quest for recognition through a voice is a wake-up call for all of us. As I said earlier, we must refocus our energies on ourselves and our sense of empowerment. We cannot depend on government to deliver what is required to protect and revitalise our languages. Because to be quite frank, where has the last few decades got us in terms of our relationship with government? The West Australian government shows no sign or interest in legislating to protect First Nation language as the former Conservative New South Wales did in 2019. Queensland government in the last couple of days moved the legislation. I don't believe the West Australian government does have a policy on First Nation languages. Minister Templeman and the Minister of the Arts and Culture has responsibility for First Nation languages in the state as an add-on to mainstream arts and culture. That pretty much highlights the minimal importance that this state government places on language. And yes, it's good that the West Australian Education Department has to some small degree supported the teaching of First Nation language in WA schools, but is not implemented in partnership with First Nations language centres. In refocusing our energies, developing our own political position to defend and revitalise First Nation language so much that it can be done. Language centres should work closely with native title entities to mesh the importance of language in native title agreements, whether they be with governments or industry. The use of language in land management and natural-based tourism has huge potential. The survival and use of our language is materially relevant to sustaining the integrity of our native title rights and interests. Right now, and I'll tell you why, because native title is not in perpetuity. Do not believe that. Native title is depending upon sustaining and maintaining the integrity of your custom and your traditional practices. If you don't speak your language, if you don't occupy your lands, if you don't practice your custom and your tradition and your culture, somebody could come and challenge you in the future. And challenge you because those ongoing, enduring nature of those practices and custom and tradition is basically what the Mabo decision is. It's based on those customs and traditions. If you look at the High Court judgment, there are three principles. One is about maintaining the custom and tradition. And if you don't do that, and language is central to that, then somebody could come into your country at some future date, in future generations, and challenge you that you don't have native title because you haven't sustained your language, you haven't looked after your country, and you haven't maintained your customs and your traditions and practices. So you need to be very careful about that. That's why language, or I'm suggesting language is so important in connecting with PBCs and all their subsidiary entities and interest in the way that you do business on land and the way that you negotiate your agreements. We have to, right now, we are looking everywhere at attempting to develop alternative systems to live in a more sustainably and equitably, so we can combat and mitigate the risk of climate change, so we can lift growing populations out of poverty, reduce rampant inequality, and halt and reverse so many forms of ecosystem destruction. Economists, developers, governments, corporates are looking for solutions. They are looking for the words, the languages, and knowledges that speak of balance, interconnectivity, holism, circular, regenerative, vibrant and thriving ways of being. What the referendum has clearly demonstrated is a need for truth-telling to address the appalling ignorance in our nation's history. I would like to see a national framework for local and regional-based oral history activities. This is an idea that I've been advocating for my position at the ANU, and I believe the language centres will have a critical role to play in this. One positive thing that the referendum highlighted is that despite the overwhelming defeat, there are millions of settled Australians that support us, including powerful interests in the corporate sector. In your continued efforts to protect and revitalise language, the corporate sector are potentially significant allies and a source for philanthropic investment. I would like to conclude with the themes of the conference and to repeat my central argument in this address. First Nations communities and their organisations should develop a comprehensive policy position to protect our language and culture as a fundamental priority of our existence as a distinct people. And through this process, First Nations assertion of governments were likely to respond and take action. I think the whole question of domestication of UNDRIP is a critical factor in the way that we design and frame these policies and negotiate with governments about their application. Unfortunately, I have to leave, but I certainly look forward to hearing about your success, your deliberations, and wish you great success in the next coming discussions. Thank you very much.